Sarah's flashlight trembled, casting wild shadows on the opposite wall. "Maybe just rats," Sarah whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. The sound was too heavy, too deliberate to be an animal. "Or they're down there," David replied. His voice dry. "Waiting for us." They stood there, suspended between the relative safety of the hallway and the unknown danger ahead. But turning back was no longer an option. They'd gone too far. "Stay close," Sarah ordered. Her detective's voice returning, she drew her pistol, its black barrel looking small and out of place in the vast darkness. They descended. Each step on the wet concrete echoed strangely. As if they were entering a tomb, the air grew colder. The chemical smell so strong it stung their eyes. David pressed his sleeve to his nose. But it did little. The smell invaded him, making his head spin, hallucinations creeping at the edges of his mind like specters. At the bottom, they found a vast, cavernous space, like an artificial cave. The ceiling was high, crisscrossed with rusted pipes dripping into stagnant puddles. Ancient machinery boilers or generators from the war era stood silent. Like prehistoric beasts, Sarah's flashlight swept the space, revealing signs of recent activity. Freshly dug earth, abandoned shovels and picks on a concrete wall. Charcoal markings formed a crude map of the basement. Adler's group had been here, searching systematically. Then they saw the source of the noise. In a far corner, under a leaking pipe, a figure crouched, back to them. It was clawing desperately at the concrete wall with bare fingers, producing the horrific scraping sound. It was John. He still wore his patient gown, now smeared with dirt. He seemed oblivious to their presence, lost in his delirium, driven by some unseen command to dig into the earth with his hands. The sight wasn't terrifying in a jump scare way. It was terrifying in a tragic, sickening way. He wasn't a monster. He was a victim. A broken tool manipulated by his family's ghosts. Sarah signaled David to stay quiet. They backed away, circling John to follow the trail left by the group. The deeper they went, the harder it was to breathe. The chemical smell mixed with damp earth and organic decay, forming a toxic brew. David's arm infection throbbed intensely, his fever blurring his vision. The concrete walls seemed to writhe, and he swore he heard the whispers of victims, no longer from the vents but echoing directly from the air around him. They reached an area of concentrated digging. The floor was broken open, exposing raw earth, and in that earth, fragments of the past emerged. A military uniform button, a piece of human skull, a blackened molar. Adler's group had found a mass grave. As Sarah examined the site, David felt a wave of dizziness. He leaned against a wall to steady himself. He closed his eyes, trying to focus. When he opened them, Sarah was gone. He was alone. "Sarah?" he called, his voice lost in the vast space. Only echoes answered. Panic surged. His flashlight trembled, casting frantic shadows. The basement seemed to have rearranged itself into a maze. "Here!" A whisper sounded right by his ear. He spun around. No one. But then, in the flashlight's beam, he saw it, on the wet wall. A dark stain oozed from a crack, like old blood, and beside it, fresh scratches on the concrete, 3 parallel lines, identical to the ones on his arm. He stumbled back, crashing into an old metal table. Rusted surgical tools clattered to the floor, the sound deafening. He wasn't alone anymore. Something was here, in the darkness, toying with him. A click sounded behind him. His flashlight went out. He was plunged into absolute darkness. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was a living entity, thick and cold, pressing against David from all sides. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. The only sound in the world, he stood frozen, holding his breath, listening. He heard breathing, a wheezing, labored breath, coming from somewhere close in the dark, and the scraping of footsteps on the gravel-strewn concrete. It was getting closer. Instinct overrode fear. David turned and ran, blindly, hands outstretched to avoid walls. The breathing and footsteps quickened behind him. This wasn't John. The movement was too fast, too deliberate. This was a predator. David tripped, his knee slamming into the floor. A growl sounded right behind his neck. He scrambled forward, hands groping in the dark. His fingers touched something cold and hard. An iron bar. He grabbed it, spun, and swung wildly. The bar hit something with a dull thud, followed by a pained groan. David didn't wait. He stood and ran. David. This way. Sarah's voice. She was nearby, her flashlight beam swept through a narrow hallway to his left. He sprinted toward it like a moth to a flame. They reunited, both gasping. What happened? Your flashlight. Sarah began. Someone's down here, David interrupted, voice shaking. They attacked me. They had no time to talk. From the darkness David had fled, they heard a crowbar dragging across the floor, sparks flaring as it scraped concrete. They knew they were here, and they were closing in. David and Sarah were no longer seekers of secrets. They were prey in an underground hunt. They ran aimlessly, deeper into the maze, hoping for an escape, a hiding place. But the basement seemed endless, and the crowbar's scrape grew closer, a deadly rhythm counting down their final moments. The crowbar's scrape against concrete, metal striking stone, and sparking in the dark, was the most horrific sound David had ever heard. It was the drumbeat of hell approaching. He and Sarah ran blindly, lungs burning from the toxic air thick with chemicals and dust. Every dark hallway looked identical, a labyrinth of despair and poison. David stumbled repeatedly, his arm infection burned, and the fever was now a constant companion. Blurring the world into a smear, shadows danced on the walls. Not from the flashlight, but from his poisoned mind. The whispers weren't disjointed anymore. They were a symphony of screams, moans and pleas in every language, from the German of prisoners to the English of forgotten patients. They merged into a sonic curse, driving him to the edge of madness. This way. Sarah shouted, her voice faint. She'd found a narrower hallway, cluttered with old crates and broken medical equipment, forming a twisting, treacherous path. They squeezed through, knocking over dusty boxes, the crashes surely alerting John to their location. His heavy footsteps grew closer. They burst into a small room, an old storage closet stacked with yellowed files and expired supplies. Sarah shoved a heavy metal cabinet against the door. The crash deafening, it bought them seconds. They were trapped. Sarah's flashlight weakly illuminated the room, revealing towering shelves of crumbling records. The air was thicker here, heavy with the smell of rotting paper and a sickly sweet stench David now recognized as evaporated formaldehyde. David collapsed, gasping, trying to breathe clean air but finding only poison. His infection's pain spread, making him curl up. His eyes scanned the files, then stopped. The numbers 27-13-8. They flashed in his mind, clear and sharp. He pulled out Eleanor's diary, flipping to the last page. There it was, scrawled, 27138. It couldn't be coincidence, Sarah. David gasped. Fighting dizziness. These numbers. 27138. It's not a code, it's a location. Sarah turned, face streaked with sweat and dirt. Location of what? Files, David said, trembling hand pointing to his stack. 1927, floor 13, shelf 8. An old filing system. Adler hid it there, the key to his real notebook. Outside, John's crowbar began pounding the door, each strike a thunderclap to their nerves. Time was running out. Sarah climbed the shelves, eyes scanning labels. 1927, floor 13, shelf 8. Her hand stopped, a rusted metal box, locked tight. Not a notebook, a small safe. David, I found it. Sarah shouted. At that moment, a massive blow shifted the cabinet. A crack split the wooden door. John was almost through. The air was thick with dust and tension. John's crowbar pounded the door. A deafening assault like hell demanding entry. Sarah struggled with the safe. Its rusted lock unyielding. It won't budge. She gasped, hands bleeding from the effort. David knelt, using his last strength to brace the cabinet. He didn't look at John. He looked at the safe. A thought sparked through the fog of fever and poison. Sarah. The key. He shouted. Adler didn't hide the notebook. He hid the key. He recalled Mary's words. This place talks to you. The blood of victims. A biometric key. And the hallucination. Adler staring down, emotionless behind round glasses. I have their blood, David said, voice near delirious. I might be part of his experiments, a descendant of his victims. What? Sarah snapped, face pale. He needed a piece of them, of us, DNA, maybe. Maybe it's a biometric key, made from the pain he caused. David fumbled in his pocket, pulling out the small lock of hair he'd found under the bed. Hair from a past victim, a fragment of DNA. He handed it to Sarah. She stared at it, then at the safe. There was no slot for a biometric scan crack. The door splintered. John burst in, no longer human, a bandaged monster. His mad eyes fixed on the diary in David's hand. He growled, lunging. John! A sharp, commanding voice rang out. Emily stood there, her impassive mask gone. Her face glowed with cold triumph. She held no gun, but a surgical scalpel gleamed in her hand. Don't ruin it, John, she said, stepping in, her gaze dripping contempt for the disfigured man. He's mine, he's the key. David looked at Emily, then at the diary, and then he saw it. A detail missed in the chaos, a name scrawled on the last page. Under the numbers, Catherine Vance Catherine. Lavra, Emily, Mary, Adler. A horrific picture emerged. Emily Adler, yes, Emily Adler, granddaughter of Dr. Adler, stood in the room, scalpel gleaming with sick intent. Gone was her weary professionalism. Her face was a blend of cold beauty and fanatical belief. You came to me, David Miller, she said, her voice sharp and commanding. Nothing like the flat tone of a nurse. Your blood, your pain. It's what we need, John lunged, but Emily signaled him to stop. No. He's mine, Sarah drew her gun. But Emily was faster. The scalpel flashed, and Sarah stumbled back, the gun clattering to the floor. This isn't a game. Detective, Emily said, picking up the gun. Your team won't find you in time. The police are coming. Sarah shouted, trying to distract her. Emily smirked. This place is full of secret passages. They'll find an empty old building. Mary staggered in, eyes wild. Enough, Emily. Enough, John. He needs saving. Emily turned, her look of contempt searing. Stupid old woman, he's a broken tool. He'll be my test subject, like the others, John. Driven by poison and madness. Growled, raising his crowbar, but Emily was too quick. She drove the scalpel into his leg. John collapsed, screaming in pain and confusion. You'll be the test subject, John, Emily said. Kicking him, like your father, like our ancestors. She turned to David. Her eyes pure madness. You have Adler's safe. You have the biometric key. You have Eleanor's diary. You'll show me where it's hidden. David looked at the diary. Then at Sarah, held at gunpoint. He had no choice. Let's go, he said, voice dry. To find the safe. The journey back to the crypt wasn't an escort. It was a grotesque procession, Emily led. Prodding Sarah with the gun, John, moaning from his leg wound, dragged his crowbar. Sparking along the concrete. Mary trailed, muttering nonsense, her eyes devoid of clarity. Only obsession. David walked among them. Not a prisoner, but a sacrificial offering led to the altar. His world no longer had clear boundaries. The basement's toxic air, now thick with John's fresh blood, fueled his fever and hallucinations. He wasn't walking through concrete halls anymore. He walked between rows of striped uniformed prisoners. Translucent and silent, they stood, gaunt faces and hollow eyes watching him. They weren't threatening, they were witnessing. Silent testaments to the parade of the air of crime and the air of pain. See? Emily whispered in his ear, her voice sick with satisfaction. They recognize you. You belong here. The pain in your blood is the key to our future. The future my grandfather planned. They reached the fragile wall David and Sarah had broken through. Mary touched its edge with a trembling hand. Here, she whispered with ghastly reverence, the final resting place. Where power begins. They crawled through, back to the crypt. Where white bones lay silent in the flashlight's beam. The stench of death was overwhelming. The safe, Emily commanded, patience gone. Where is it? The Adler lineage surely recorded a hidden secret. But its exact location was lost to time. David didn't need to think. He felt it. A cold resonance between his blood and something hidden in these walls. He raised a trembling arm, pointing to an unremarkable concrete section. There, John, with a growl, swung his crowbar. Mortar crumbled, revealing red brick beneath. He kept swinging until the wall collapsed, exposing a dark alcove inside. On a stone pedestal was a thick black metal safe on its door. A tarnished silver plate with a small slot. Your blood, Emily ordered, pressing the scalpel to David's infected hand. He gritted his teeth as the blade sliced a new cut, blood mixing with the swollen skin. She grabbed his hand, pressing it to the plate. Blood flowed into the slot. They waited. Nothing happened. IT doesn't work. Emily screamed, enraged. Maybe. It needs more, Mary muttered, her mad eyes fixed on David. Pain. Adler said the greater the pain, the stronger the power. But then, a faint click came from within the safe. An ancient mechanism, triggered by proteins in the victim's bloodline, activated. The heavy iron door creaked open with a mournful groan. Inside, on faded red velvet, was the black leather notebook they sought. Emily lunged, snatching it like a starving beast. Her eyes blazed with fanaticism and ambition. This was it, the family legacy, the key to power. She flipped through the pages, searching for formulas, diagrams, bioweapon secrets, but nothing, just words, Pages and pages of meticulous handwriting. Names, she whispered, voice trembling with confusion. Dates. Experiment descriptions. Confessions. Her face shifted from triumph to confusion, then to rage. What is this? The confessions of a mad old man? Where are the formulas? The power? She'd been deceived, not by David, but by history. By the myth her family had woven. Adler wasn't a genius crafting ultimate weapons. He was a meticulous butcher, recording his cruelty with sick precision. His legacy wasn't power, it was crime, useless. Emily screamed, her rage twisting her face. All of IT garbage. In her fury, she hurled the heavy notebook at the opposite wall. It didn't hit the wall, it struck something else, a massive, rusted water pipe running along the wall. A piercing clang echoed, followed by a groan of strained metal. Rust flaked off, a small crack appeared in the pipe. Then, with a shrieking hiss, the crack burst open. A thick yellow-green gas, foul and ancient, erupted from the broken pipe with terrifying force. It reeked of burnt almonds and millennia-old decay. The toxic cloud engulfed the crypt, turning the cramped space into a gas chamber. Everyone began choking. David felt his lungs burning. Sarah tried to cover her nose with her shirt, but it was futile. Reality, already fragile, shattered completely. A collective hallucination hit, a psychic storm ignited by the massive dose of gas. Each person sank into their own hell. John screamed. No longer in the basement, but trapped in a mangled car, flames engulfing him. The sound of tearing metal and his own breaking bones looping endlessly. Unable to endure, he swung his crowbar at his own head. Seeking release in death, Mary wailed, seeing John. Not the disfigured man, but a boy. Strapped to Adler's operating table, she tried to save him. But her feet sank into a swamp of human bones. Emily's was the most horrific. She saw them all, the diary's victims. They rose from the bones, no longer faint specters but rotting. Fleshy bodies, their eyes blazing with accusation. They surrounded her, bony fingers touching her. And then she saw Adler, her grandfather, standing among them. Laughing at her failure, she screamed, firing Sarah's gun wildly at the visions, until the final bullet struck her own reflection in a puddle. David and Sarah were swept into the storm, but their visions differed. David saw the prisoners rise, not to attack but to salute him. He saw Eleanor smile. For him, this wasn't hell. It was release. He saw the souls, having witnessed justice slowly fade amid the chaos. He knew one thing. He had to get Sarah out. He grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the only exit, toward the faint promise of clean air. Leaving behind a symphony of madness and death, they stumbled out of the crypt. The toxic air clinging to their lungs, David half-carried Sarah, who coughed violently. They didn't look back. Where a deranged family tragedy had self-destructed in its toxic legacy. They climbed the stairs, each step a monumental effort. When they pushed open the basement door and breathed the cleaner hallway air, they nearly collapsed. Then they heard it, not whispers, not footsteps, but the crackle of radios and the sound of many boots running. Bright floodlights swept the hallway, banishing the ghostly shadows. A team of uniformed police, weapons ready, stormed in, seeing David and Sarah. Filthy, exhausted, and panicked, they lowered their guns. Police, are you safe? Sarah, regaining strength, raised her badge. Detective Connolly, she gasped. All suspects neutralized. We need a hazmat team. Now, the basement. Gas leak. The real world had arrived. Order, law, and science came to face the nightmare. What followed was a blur in David's mind. He saw figures in white hazmat suits, like astronauts from another planet, entering the basement. He heard the roar of industrial fans sucking the toxic air out of the earth. David stood at the door, wrapped in a thermal blanket, watching the yellow-green fog slowly drawn from the darkness. In that fog, he saw them one last time, the prisoners, Eleanor, the children. They weren't pained or angry anymore, they were dissolving. Not ascending to heaven, but blending into the fresh air being pumped in, as if finally breathing freely after a century of burial. He saw Eleanor smile and nod gratefully before fading completely. It was a hallucination, he knew, a final vision from the lingering gas and a damaged mind. But to him, it was true transcendence. The police sealed St. Mary's. They found the bodies in the basement. They found the mass grave and Adler's notebook. The truth, more horrific than any rumor, was finally exposed. The story of a family conspiracy to claim a criminal legacy ended in tragedy and madness. David and Sarah were taken to a clean, modern hospital. David's infection was treated with strong antibiotics. Doctors said he was lucky to survive inhaling such a large dose of old industrial chemicals, which caused extreme hallucinations. Everything had a rational, scientific explanation. But those explanations couldn't erase what he'd seen, felt. He sat in a pristine hospital room, looking out at a normal world. He was safe, but he didn't feel it days later. David was discharged. He returned to his apartment. Once a safe space, now alien and empty, he was diagnosed with severe PTSD. The invisible scars hurt more than the scratches on his arm. He flinched at the smallest sounds. The kettle's whistle sounded like a bursting pipe. The wind through a window sounded like whispers. He avoided looking into dark corners, fearing a face staring back. He'd won, he'd survived. But he felt part of his soul was left in St. Mary's basement, buried with the bones and rotting secrets. David fought. He went to therapy. He tried to paint again. But his canvases were only dark hallways and distorted faces. He dove into research, trying to control his fear with knowledge. He read about the Lenape burial ground, chemical effects on the brain, collective hallucinations. He tried to box everything into neat categories of science and history. It was the gas, it was PTSD, it was history. He repeated these like a mantra one afternoon, walking in a park to find some peace. He saw her, a woman on a bench, reading. Her blonde hair was neatly pinned. When she looked up, David's blood froze. Those empty blue eyes, Emily, his heart stopped. He stood frozen, unable to breathe. She smiled, a cold, knowing smile. Then looked back at her book. David blinked. She was gone. Just an empty bench. It was a hallucination. Stress-induced, he knew it, but how real it felt. Was everything he'd experienced just his damaged mind? Or had something, a curse, an idea, escaped St. Mary's with him, now toying with his reality? The boundary was gone that night, exhausted by panic. David took a prescribed sleeping pill. He craved dreamless sleep, a few hours of oblivion. He sank into sleep, and then he woke, not in his apartment. He was on a rusted iron bed, above a yellowed, stained ceiling, a map of hell. The smell of antiseptic and mold filled his nose. The steady, cold beep of a monitor sounded in his ear. The pain in his jaw throbbed. No, it couldn't be. It couldn't. The investigation. Sarah, the diary, the basement, the confrontation. The rescue, the police, PTSD, all a dream? A vivid, detailed delirium from his initial septic fever? He'd never left this room. He'd never won. The door creaked open. Emily entered. Her face weary from a long shift, she checked his four. Her movements mechanical, emotionless. She touched his forehead. "Your fever's up again," she said flatly. Then she leaned closer, as if to adjust his pillow. Her breath, faintly coffee-scented, brushed his ear, and she whispered, just loud enough for him, a sentence that shattered his last shred of sanity, trapping him in an eternal loop of hell. "The next cycle will be more interesting." The chill of Emily's whisper spread through David's body, colder than any sedative or fevered death. "The next cycle will be more interesting." It wasn't a threat. It was a fact, a law of this insane universe. The panic David felt wasn't ordinary fear. It wasn't fear of attack or death. It was metaphysical horror. The dread of a soul realizing its prison bars weren't metal, but its own consciousness. He tried to scream. He wanted to yell in Emily's face, to shout to the world about this absurdity. But no sound came. His throat was choked by an invisible hand. He tried to move, to thrash, but his body no longer obeyed. He was a captive audience, strapped to a seat, forced to watch his own horror film on repeat. Emily looked at him. A fleeting glance not of malice, but of tired indifference. As if too accustomed to her role, she adjusted his four, scribbled on his chart, and left silently, leaving David with the horrific truth just revealed. That day, and many after, David stopped fighting. He sank into a near-vegetative state. He accepted. He accepted that the world beyond the window was just a backdrop. He accepted that the nurses and doctors were actors in his play. He ate when fed, drank when given. Let them move his lifeless body. He gave up. How could he fight his own mind? How could he escape a prison without walls? The world blurred. He saw Mary wheeled past his door, her face kind, smiling at another nurse. He saw John in physical therapy, taking labored steps. His face unbandaged, only faint scars. They were real patients. And he'd turned them into monsters in his delirium. Sarah likely never existed. It was all him. He thought he'd live like this forever. A shadow in his own loop, until the fever burned him out or his mind dissolved completely. But then, something strange happened. One morning, after a nurse helped him wash, he was seated by the bed to improve circulation. He sat, staring blankly at the old tiled floor. And he saw it, near the chair's leg, in a small crack between tiles, was something, a tiny dark brown object, nearly blending with the dirt. With a slow, almost unconscious movement, he leaned down, using weak fingers to pry it up. It was a small lock of hair, tied with a faded red thread. The hair he'd found under the bed in his nightmare. A victim's hair. It couldn't be here. It was a figment, a detail in a false story. But now he held it, feeling its dry texture, smelling its musty, ancient scent. It was real, and if it was real, what was false? The hair's touch was like an electric shock, waking a dormant part of his brain, the loop, the delirium. The rational explanation crumbled. A crack appeared in the reality he'd accepted. He scanned the room. It was still room 13, but now he saw it differently. The wall stains weren't random, they formed faint German letters. He looked at the vent and heard, faintly, the whisper returning. Which reality was true? Which delirium was real? His head throbbed. He stood, staggering. He had to escape. Not the hospital, the loop itself. He reached the door, turned the knob. It wasn't locked. He stepped into the hallway. It wasn't St. Mary's hallway. It was stark white, a sterile, blinding white, flawless floor, walls, ceiling. All seamless white, lit by recessed LEDs, no windows, no musty smell. Only sharp antiseptic and the low hum of air conditioning. He wasn't wearing a worn hospital gown. He wore a simple gray outfit, no buttons, no zippers. He looked at his hands, no 4 marks, the scratches were gone. Where was he? He turned. The door he'd exited wasn't wood. It was thick metal with no external handle. Instead of 13, it bore a laser-etched label. Psychological testing area, subject 117. Memories no, layers of memories surged, overlapping, causing excruciating pain. St. Mary's, the sepsis fever, that was a facade. A scripted simulation to elicit specific psychological responses. Adler, Eleanor, Sarah, Mary. They weren't figments of his fever. They were characters in a programmed story, the hair in his hand. Perhaps an Easter egg, a system glitch, or a test to see if the subject's consciousness could recognize the absurdity and break the script. He'd escaped. But escaping one prison only revealed another, larger one. A door at the end of the white hallway slid open. A woman entered, wearing a lab coat. Holding a tablet, her blonde hair was neatly pinned. Her blue eyes cold and calculating. It was Emily. Or the person scripted to play Emily. She glanced at her tablet, then at David. Her expression wasn't surprise. It was a scientist's amusement. "Impressive," she said, her voice sharp, emotionless. Subject 117 broke the original script faster than expected. It seems implanting genetic memories from the victim's lineage created higher psychological instability than predicted. She tapped the tablet. Note: St. Mary's 1.0 simulation loop terminated. Subject has become aware of the containment environment. Prepare for phase 2, she looked at David. A cold, professional smile spreading. Don't worry, David. The next cycle will be far more interesting. Behind her, 2 large men in black security uniforms approached. Holding electric batons, the escape was over. The experiment had just begun.